The last time Cameron Cloutier was a guest on Twin Peaks Conversations, it was the summer of 2022, and he was promoting the release of his fan film Queen of Hearts, about Annie Blackburn's strange journeys before and after season 2, crosscut with a fleshed out retelling of the Cooper Wyndham Caroline backstory. Now Cameron is back to announce the upcoming fundraising drive for his follow up, Black Rose, which continues Annie's story and crosscuts another backstory involving Blackie and One-Eyed Jacks. In this conversation, we'll be joined by Josh Eisenstadt, a longtime staple of the Twin Peaks fan community. He is considering a fan film production of his own, which may collaborate with Cameron, but as that project's currently up in the air, we won't be discussing that too much in this discussion. We'll be focusing more on general Twin Peaks subjects. As usual, the public part of this conversation will focus on the guest's work, well, in the much longer back section, exclusive to the $5 a month tier on patreon.com/lostinthemovies, is a much more wide-ranging discussion. Before we begin, I want to share some updates on my own projects. This is a bonus episode of Twin Peaks Conversations, which ended its regular monthly run last year, although I still have occasional episodes planned for the future. Since that last official episode, I continued my Twin Peaks character series with numbers 45 through 31 before pausing. Last fall, I stepped back from offering public film writing or podcasts on my site, but only after several more reviews and reflections that were often pertinent to this farewell theme, plus a bonus season of my public Lost in the Movies podcast focused on films from the Sight and Sound all-time greatest list, which I hadn't reviewed before, including a guest appearance by the previous Twin Peaks Conversations guest, Ashley Brand. I also wrapped up a previous Patreon podcast series with a dozen discussions of films from the 2010s, a couple from the 2020s, concluding a decade series that I've been doing for a while. I concluded this approach after 15 years in order to focus on two areas. The first area is finishing my three big Twin Peaks projects, the public release of my Lost in Twin Peaks podcast, the written character series, and the video essays of Journey Through Twin Peaks. Mostly this work has focused on the character series and occurred behind the scenes, with some previews for patrons, although I did finally make the Lost in Twin Peaks Season 3 finale public at the end of 2023, so only Season 2 remains for that. The second area of focus is maintaining monthly rewards on Patreon. These now include those advances for the character studies for the $1 a month tier, and exclusive podcasts or written entries every month for the $5 a month tier. Every other month, those $5 a month patrons vote in a poll to pick what will be covered as part of the Films in Focus podcast. I'll discuss that content more at the end of this podcast as we transition into the Patreon part of the conversation. But for now, let's begin the public portion with Cameron and Josh. Let's start off with talking about first your film. You can mention a little bit. I think most of the listeners will be at this point somewhat familiar with your Queen of Hearts, maybe not. So tell them about that a little, and then tell them about your new idea.
It's funny because you say a lot of people would know Queen of Hearts. You would be surprised now how many people don't know about Queen of Hearts, which is kind of exciting because it means that people can still discover it. But
for those listeners who I guess haven't seen it, then tell them a little bit about what it is and why you decided to make a continuation for it.
Well, the idea of Queen of Hearts always sprung from me wanting to tell two stories. One would be what was Annie's story post season 2 until she got to Laura in Fire Walk with Me, and the other one would have been Cooper's relationship with both Wyndham and Caroline. And I always had this idea going as far back as when Fire Walk with Me first came out. I would tell Annie's story post season 2, I would tell the Wyndham Caroline story, and I would cut back and forth between both of them, Godfather 2 style, until both women are in the Black Lodge looking at each other wearing the same dress. And I always thought that the movie would end with Annie getting lost in the Black Lodge into the drapes, and at a certain point she would just throw one of the red velvet drapes off of her, and that would have been the bedspread going over Laura in the bed, and then that would cause Laura to look down at her, and so she could give Laura the message. I always thought that was what the film was going to be, and then obviously it never got made. Then cut to season 3 comes out, and I'm thinking, okay, cool, they're going to deal with Annie. Well, they did mention her in one scene, but they didn't dive into it. So I was like, oh, that's interesting that they still didn't do that. I was like, I always had this idea of doing a film, and people were like, oh, you should make it. And I was like, well, I guess it would have to be in this fan film type of thing. So then the idea of like blending in the final dossier into it, as well as season 3 aspects of dealing with the firemen and Freddie and all that, and then bringing in the ending of season 3. Miraculously, the film got funded, and it took me 3 years in a pandemic to get it done, but I got
Mhm.
it done. But I never really thought about doing a continuation. I had thought about ideas, but I never really explored it. I just kind of said, well, this is some of the things that I would want to deal with. It wasn't until I started talking with Josh more and us hanging out, and he said to me, Queen of Hearts to him was the greatest Twin Peaks fan film he's ever seen. And he goes, he said, and what's miraculous about it is that you managed to do it without knowing me. Because this guy knows everything about everything. And imagine if Josh had been on the set of Queen of Hearts, right? I mean, it would have been even more wild. So the idea that like he was so impressed, and the thing that impressed him the most was one, the My Life, My Tapes. The other thing was the fact that when Cooper is holding Caroline in the living room after they've been attacked, there's like a shot of Bob behind them, and he's like, "You didn't have to do that, okay? You didn't have to go and get an actor to have him play Bob, but you needed Bob in that scene because of the whole thing that Leland Bob says to Cooper and in Twin Peaks about knowing about Pittsburgh and that type of thing." So he loved the fact that I went that extra step to make a 3-second detail in there. So he was just like, "I want to know what happens next," and I started telling him about some of the things that I would want to do with it, and he's like, "That sounds great. You should totally make it." And I was like, I don't know. It was so hard to make the first one. He goes, "Yeah, but you now know what not to do. And plus now you know me and I have film experience and I know people who know people. We can get people together. We could, do this." I said, "Oh, on a bigger scale than, because that was the thing that Maddie, who played Annie in the film and helped co-produce the movie with me, we always said we would never come back to this material unless we had more equipment, better equipment, more
Right.
money, that type of thing, because it was
So there was,
so
like, the logistical aspect to it too, as well as the creative aspect that you kinda realized if you crossed your streams, you could benefit each other.
right. And also, we just didn't want, it was so hard to make the first time that we don't want to do that again.
Mm.
We want to have a little bit of relaxing and not looking over our shoulders to see if the Rangers are going to show up to shut us down in the park. I started floating this idea to some of the cast members from Queen of Hearts that would return, and like Maddie, and she was like, "I'm in." So I said to Josh, I said, "Okay, I'm interested in doing it, but what is one thing you wanted to do?" And we've talked about different stories. Like, we've always said, Josh and I've always said, it would be great for somebody, I'm throwing this out there, it'd be
Mhm.
great for somebody out there to tell the whole Andrew Packard, Thomas Eckert story with Josie. Like, that's ripe for a film. But in order to do that, you'd have to shoot it in Hong Kong. Right? This is the thing. It's like Josh and I are very much into authenticity. If it takes place in Hong Kong, you better shoot it in Hong Kong. I mean, yeah, you can do green screens, but it's not quite the same thing.
You're at least somewhat going forward in time with Annie after the events of Queen of Hearts,
Right.
which ends, I think, we can, without spoiling too
Yeah.
much, we can say it ends
Like
a
5 minutes,
little.
like 5
e-
minutes past season 3.
Exactly. Like it pretty much dovetails in the end with season three. But your new film is also going to be combining that with, I think, another character story, which I guess is not too much of a. You've sort of tipped your hand in the promotions and things
Mm,
like that, and also, of course, in the name of the film, which is Black Rose.
right.
So, tell us a little bit about that.
So it goes into One Eye Jacks. It goes into certain characters in One Eye Jacks. It's going to be dealing with a certain person who goes by the name of Black Rose. It's also going to be dealing with a lot of side characters that we know interact with that character. There's also new characters in there. But what is that line in season 3? The past dictates the future, right? So my film is going to be like Queen Hearts, where it tells two stories. And like Queen of Hearts, the story in the past will influence the story in the present tense. So it's not just two separate short stories, thrown together. There is a lineage there.
Mhm.
And also with the name Black Rose, yes, it does refer to a character, but it's also the
Yeah.
overall mood of the piece. I mean, keep in mind
Mhm.
that the end of season 3 ends in darkness.
Yeah.
and the fact that, we're dealing with, the blue rose, the black rose, and then even the way I have it written, it's in that blue velvet font, right?
Right.
So there's just a lot of different influences coming in there. But I love this idea of going into the world of One Eye Jacks, which is like something that, Queen of Hearts didn't get into at all, didn't need to. But like that's something that is ripe for exploration. You know, one of the things about Queen of Hearts was that it had to fit within the parameters of what Lynch and Frost set up, and it had to, you know, not negate anything. Whereas this film is going to go past season 3, so you know I'm not shackled to that. Not that I felt shackled before, but you know now it's like freedom. As I've said with Josh, it's like Queen of Hearts was like a missing piece. This is like a what if, you
Yeah.
know what I mean? And it's going to be completely thrown under the bus the moment anybody official makes whatever the new incarnation of Twin Peaks is. Nobody is going to do my story. So my story is going to be completely just thrown under the bus. However, because they've set up the idea of multiple timelines, my
Yeah.
story can still exist
Right.
theoretically.
There's room for it under that umbrella.
There, theoretically, right? You know, it's funny because I mentioned earlier that Queen of Hearts still seems to be sort of this underground thing, which is kind of cool in a way. While there are some people who say, "What is Queen of Hearts?" There's other people who are like, "Oh, I'm so down for a continuation." Because when I brought up the idea on my channel about doing a
Mhm.
continuation, people automatically were like, "Oh, I want this." Now you were like, "I don't understand. How is there a continuation?"
Yeah.
But
What's sort of what I said after Firewalk with me. Tell the listeners a little bit about what you're doing right now in order to promote this and fundraise and all that, what they can do to help out.
well, right now I'm setting up the crowdfunding campaign. At this moment in time, we haven't launched yet. We're launching May 14th at 6 a.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. Eastern. I had to pick a time there. You know, this idea of doing a continuation of Queen of Hearts was always like a just a oh, wouldn't that be fun? Yeah, it'd be cute, this and that. But now I'm like, I'm so deep into this now that it's like it's almost like I almost think that Queen of Hearts is not complete now without this one. Like I feel like Queen of Hearts is now season 3, and there needs to be the back half that concludes it.
Yeah.
And that's what this is. And I never really thought about it. I thought again, you were talking about Fire Walk with Me being the closure for you. Well, that's why Queen of Hearts, when I thought about it back when Fire Walk with Me just came out, obviously there's none of the final dossier and season 3 stuff, but I always wanted it to just be the Caroline Annie stuff and how she got to Laura and have it fit within that storyline. And then when season 3 came out, obviously it fits all that in. It was always going to be a missing piece of that. So now, I mean, the idea of doing this continuation thing, which again was spurred on by hanging out with Josh for a few days, and us kind of riffing back and forth about things, and now like I've shot a teaser trailer for it, and you know Josh came along for that, and we were, you know, and that was just insane and wild, and I can't, you know, and it came out good, so it's like I'm thrilled.
As far as Josh goes, give us, as the listeners, a little bit of your background of when you first watched the show, what it was that pulled you in, and kind of where you went with that afterwards. Because I think the whole culture was hooked into Twin Peaks for maybe a few months, and then they moved on, and you and others have sort of stayed with it. And I think in the 90s and
Yeah.
2000s, it was sort of like a small band. But start us off at the beginning of that
Oh,
story if you
extremely
could.
small band. Okay. So the story really starts with, for me, with episode 2.
Mm,
So the dream sequence episode. So my parents were watching the show. Like I said, I was a little kid. And I happened to walk in when they were watching the beginning of episode 2. And I would have walked in right around the scene with, the let's hop in the boat scene with Jerry and Ben. That
mm,
was about when I walked in the room. And I think there was something I wanted to show my dad in the other room. I don't even know what anymore. And they said, "Wait, we're watching this." And I said, "Well, why? I want to show you something. You know how kids are." And then I sat in there, and all of a sudden the show, that whatever it was they were watching, started pulling me in. And then they go to One Eye Jacks, and of course at that point I didn't understand obviously the full implication of what
mhm.
that was, but nonetheless, it was still fascinating. And then Bobby and Mike and Leo in the woods, and I just start getting more and more pulled in. And by the time and I start asking my parents questions, "What is this? What's going on? Who's this? Who's that?" And then when the dream sequence happened, I was hooked. And apparently, when it ended, I turned to my parents and I said, "This is the best thing I've ever seen. I want to know everything about this." Here we 30 some years later, right? What's changed?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what started it. And then, at school, nobody, nobody was into it. And once I got a little bit older, I started showing it to all my friends. And then the Twin Peaks Festival started. Or I went to the first one that I went to in '94, and I realized there were other people like me out there. And I found, and it became a very small band, and then there were the early internet sites that had,
Mhm.
before social media. And I remember going to dial in AOL with the name Agent Cooper, hoping to attract other Twin Peaks fans because, I had, and then as the festivals continued, I got to know more and more people and made more and more friends and found that I found other like-minded people. And never would I have dreamed and been, I would have been thrilled if people would have told me the show was going to come back and that there'd be more people than ever that are into it and continue to be.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that period because I came in and what I guess at this point, you could probably call it the second generation, even though it was like a long distance from the original show. I was also pretty young when it came on. I was about 7, so I did not watch it in my case. As vaguely aware of its existence in the 90s and 2000s, like, oh, there was a David Lynch show. It had a talking dwarf. I think I pictured like a gnome with a long white beard, like in the woods or something, whatever, or backwards talking. I mean, I was like a couple years before the gold box. I tried to rent it and I got that Netflix. It was episode 1 of season 1. So the second
Right.
episode, right?
No
And
pilot.
so it was
Yeah.
like, so yeah, so it was finally the gold box. But so I kind of missed that whole period. And so going back, looking at it now, it's like the medieval period of Twin Peaks fandom, where it's
That's
like you have
actually
this
accurate.
long dark ages, but it's kind of
It
beautiful too. It's
it,
like
it
you
was
and
It is.
John Thorne and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, John Thorne. That's where I met John Thorne in '94 at the festival, and became John Thorne and Craig Miller, who was the other. John Thorne and Craig Miller together did Wrapped in Plastic, and Craig Miller unfortunately passed away like 11 years
Right.
ago.
Yeah.
But I met both of them at the '94, and became quick friends with them. And just it was this small group of those of us that would go up to Washington once a year. And I mean, if we had more time, I could tell you a lot more stories, basically step by step through that and how it built and when it got bigger, and because there were a lot of ebbs and flows.
When did you step over the line from being somebody who was like observing this phenomenon and a fan, and then at a certain point you start participating in interviews and I think you were, I mean, I know by Mulholland Drive you were involved with the production or at least present for the production or something like
Yeah,
that.
I
Like
was
you were
on Mulholland
around
Drive for 2 days.
when Lynch was shooting it. Yeah. So what was your journey into that aspect of it, I guess, being almost a
I guess
participant in a way?
it just happened organically. I started meeting Grace and then Cheryl
Mhm.
Lee, and then also through going to the festivals, and then eventually around '96 or '97, I proposed to Don and Pat Shook, who were the original organizers of the festival, that I do a trivia game. So I
Aha.
started doing a trivia game then, and that's something that I just literally brought back at the real Twin Peaks days
Yeah.
and did again.
Oh, that's fun.
And that
Nice.
happened for a lot of years, and so I kinda got involved, and then I just started getting to know a lot of the cast, and, I live in LA, and I wanted to that was before I was working in the movie industry. I wanted to work in the movie industry, and
Oh,
then
okay.
I started doing that, and doing that, I meet more and more people, and then certain cast members would introduce me to other ones, like, Grace introduced me to Richard Beamer. That's how I got to know Richard Beamer,
Hmm.
and so I just started just organically forming friendships with a lot of the people involved, and it just kinda naturally happened. And so I kinda got more involved that way, and then when the first DVD sets, the season 1 DVD sets came up, at that time, I had an apartment out in Westwood, and that company was in Westwood, and
Ah.
I don't remember how they got a hold of me, but somebody recommended it. Started happening at any time a Twin Peaks event would happen, somebody would recommend that somebody get a hold of me.
Mhm.
So there are so many different events I was involved in. I remember a memorial for Jack Nance in '98, which is where I first met Charlotte Stewart, because she was helping out. She at that point owned a catering company, and she was helping out with the catering for
Mm.
that event. So I got involved helping out with that event. And it was at a play of Macbeth starring Wendy Roby.
Oh, wow.
So I mean, I could go into all this in detail, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of different stepping points. And then the season 1 DVD, when they wanted my help getting certain cast members, and I helped them do it, and then they ended up interviewing me on that. I didn't know they were going to do that, and that's what's on the Fire Walk with Me DVD, because they also did that one and that whole documentary, which is a whole other story. I had no idea
Yeah.
they were gonna do it that way, but,
Oh, yeah, were they jumping around between the lines and stuff, between, like,
yeah,
halfway through somebody saying something? Yeah, that one's
yeah,
a
and I
trip.
remember I saw that early because like I said, I had an
Yeah,
apartment here. They asked me to come over, they wanted to show me that, and they showed it
yeah.
to me, and I'm sitting there before it was out, and I don't know what to say because I'm thinking people are going to hate this, and I have no idea what to say.
Yeah, that's oh god. And now it's almost become like grandfathered into the lore. It's like when they released the Criterion, didn't they put that one on there? Like I
They
know it's
did.
on the entire mystery.
Yeah, they did, which I was surprised that it was.
So it's literally on the Criterion collection now. It's become almost like this cult object, I feel like.
And then they put me in there, but they didn't say who I was.
Right.
So, which was odd. I didn't, like I said, I didn't know I was gonna be in there, then they filmed me
Yeah.
for it. I didn't know they were gonna use me in it, so that was all a surprise
Yeah.
to me as it was
And
to
And
anybody else.
and
just
this
for those listening, because I didn't reference it by name, we're talking about the Reflections on Twin Peaks documentary that's on the old New Line Fire Walk with Me DVD, and then also included on later editions.
but this is kind of funny though, because this is in a roundabout way how I was introduced to who Josh was.
Right.
Because I had no idea who Josh was. I had never been to a festival. They just pan over to him for like 3 seconds, and then there's no explanation of who the guy is. And so for years, I would say to people, "Who the hell is this guy?" You know, it's like I don't. He's talking about many layers of
Mm.
mystery, and I don't understand what's going on. Who is this person? And I didn't even understand the concept of that documentary because it's so edited, so crazy.
I don't
And
either, if that helps.
yeah, I know. So then like people when I started doing the show, people said, "Oh, that's Josh Eisenstadt." I remember one time on the show going, "Who the hell is Josh Eisenstadt?"
Oh, you
I don't
did?
I don't yeah, I was like, "Who is this guy?" Like I've never they're like, "Oh, he is like he's the main guy at the festivals. He does a trivia game." I'm like, "Awesome." But I just, I had no reason to reach out to Josh at all. And then one day, out of the blue a few years ago, his mom contacts me and it was just like, I think you and Josh would really get
Oh,
along.
no kidding. That's
Yeah.
hilarious.
And and so she,
Parental intervention.
so his mom actually kind of put us together,
Oh,
and
that's funny.
we talked a few times on the phone, and like I didn't know who he was. I was happy to talk to him, and like he was kind of sussing me out, see if I was a crazy person, and then we realized, oh no, we're actually
We're both
like
sane.
we're
That's
both
funny.
sane, and in many ways, and I said this to
Yeah.
Josh too, we're kind of like long lost brothers that we had never connected in 30 years. But if we had met in 94, we probably would have been best friends for 30 years.
That's funny. But one thing I did want to make sure we talked about was your friendship with Pamela Gidley, and she was,
Yes.
of course, the actress who played Teresa Banks in Fire Walk with Me. And I would love to hear a little bit about that, and just to sort of throw I guess, my fascination with this into the ring, besides just, loving her performance in Fire Walk with Me. When she passed away, I found out kind of to my shock that she lived like basically 2 towns over from me in like a random town in New Hampshire that is not like a
Oh, really? Oh, you're
a
living
big
in
hub.
Vermont.
Like she died or she lived and died in Seabrook, New Hampshire. And I actually knew people, older like friends of my father who knew her, were friendly with her family. I think they knew, oh, she was a model and she acted like they didn't know what she was in. They didn't know she had a Twin Peaks connection, but they're like, oh yeah, Pamela. Oh, that was horrible. I was like kind of blown away. I mean, this Seabrook, New Hampshire. Although I will throw out, it also has a weird connection to Little Abner, but that's a subject for another day. So there are weird Seabrook connections out there, but it's a very random kind of small town in New Hampshire. So I've been fascinated, just to, I guess, know more about her, ever
I
since
can tell
that
you a lot.
happened.
Yeah, so I first met Pamela Gidley. Obviously, I knew her when she lived in LA. And when she moved out of LA, I kept in touch with her via phone for quite a while. And I think I was I mean, the frequency of phone calls dropped, and I might have, by the end, I might have only talked to her maybe once a year,
Mhm.
which is unfortunate. It's just one of those things, when you have a friend and they move out of the state,
Yeah.
obviously your frequency of communication drops. It's not because you want it to, it just kind of happens. But I first met Pamela, uh, Brian, aka Dougpa, and I were doing interviews. I don't even remember what year this was, way back when. We were doing interviews hoping to drum up interest with these interviews of Firewalk with Me cast members to get the Firewalk with Me deleted scenes released.
Right.
And this, just to intervene for a second, so listeners know, this was then assembled into the questions. Is it Questions in a World of Blue documentary, right?
So anytime in the entire mystery, when you see the Pamela interview, that's the first
Yeah.
time I met Pamela. That's that interview.
Oh, okay.
So we went over to Brian had arranged that. Brian got that set up, and I remember he had contacted me and said, I got Pamela for an interview. Do you want to come? I said, oh yeah, definitely, because we both had a fascination with the Teresa Banks character.
Mm. Yeah, that
So
was his logo on the Dugpa form, if I remember correctly, right?
yes, it was. Yeah, because we both shared that. Actually, we both shared that interest in that character. So we both went over there and we interviewed her at her place. And immediately, you know how sometimes you meet somebody and you just hit it off with them and you know you're going to be friends. Like by the time I left there, we were already fast friends. And next thing I know, I was going over there and hanging out on a regular basis. And she was into also filmmaking, so I was going to work on some stuff with her. And I was kind of showing her editing. I remember that was back in the days of Final Cut Pro. I remember kind of showing her how to use Final Cut Pro, and just became very good friends with her, and hung out, started hanging out with her a lot, and that's kind of how it happened.
Now, Josh, who taught you Final Cut Pro?
Well, editing was taught to me by Richard Beamer
Oh, really?
way
Nice.
back when, and it was taught. Yeah, Richard Beamer. He was the one that got me into that.
you
Mr.
and
Ben Horn.
you and Michael J. Anderson.
Correct.
Oh, yeah.
He was
Before
teaching
he
both of you.
Yeah.
before he lost his mind. This is back when he was,
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's an interview in one of the postcards. I don't know if you're the one who conducted it of Richard Bamer where he's talking about his peyote trip and then you just hear a voice and the camera pans over and like Michael J. Anderson's been sitting there the whole time. Like,
that was
oh
at my
God.
parents' house. That interview was
Nice.
at my
Okay,
parents'
that
house.
cracks me up so
Yeah,
much.
because my
It's
parents
like,
were also really good friends with Richard Beamer. We
yeah.
all were. Our whole family was. So back then, that was the season 1 DVD. I didn't conduct
Mm,
those interviews, but I helped out. I helped them get a couple of the cast members, Richard
mhm.
being one of them,
Yeah.
because Richard notoriously doesn't like to do interviews and stuff like that, so he kind of had to be talked into it.
Mhm.
So he came over. So that interview was conducted at my parents' house at the same time the Little Mike interview was conducted, and that's kind of why I didn't know they were going to put me on camera, but they did. That's why I'm on there.
So Josh is going to join us for part of the Patreon conversation as well, where we're going to talk about all different Twin Peaks topics. But for the rest of the public part here, I want to get back to you, Cameron, and talk a little bit more about this particular film. And I guess in terms of like that secondary story, the Blackie part, I guess we can say it, it is Black Rose O'Reilly, the owner of One Eye Jacks, who's going to be one of the characters in this. Were there other options you kind of considered at some point in terms of like how to structure it? Like, did you always want to have two stories and you're sort of toying around with different things to pair with Annie?
I like the structure of Queen of Hearts. I like that back and forth. Obviously, that had a real purpose because it was two characters that were basically created to be intertwined, right? Annie is the redemption arc for Cooper from the Caroline arc. The fact that Annie and Caroline interchange in the lodge
Hmm.
at one point in the season 2 finale. I wanted to tie in, the two stories, and it just seemed like this would be a way to tell an offshoot story but also be able to blend it together with the main storyline. Because I was always thinking about, like, well, what other side stories would I be interested in telling? There's a lot of
Right.
side stories
Yeah, I
in
would
Twin Peaks.
imagine you have a notebook full of,
No, because honestly, like,
or a mental notebook,
this is,
maybe.
I mean, I know I said this with Queen of Hearts, but for me it's like this is it. There are so many side stories you could tell, but I want to save those for people who have a burning desire for those. Um, I don't know if there's anybody else in this world that had the burning desire to tell Annie Blackburn's story like I did. You know what I mean? Like, so I felt like I was compelled to do that. There's other people who would, might want to tell the Thomas Eckert, Andrew Packard story, and God bless them. I can't wait to watch it. I don't want to make it, but I want to watch it.
Yeah.
Obviously, for legal reasons, you have to say a fan film because that's what it is. However, um, I love this idea of exploring this material from other points of views. I think there is something, I mean, we do it all the time in our discussions, right? That's one of the reasons why I always date my videos,
Mm.
because there are, like I said, there are things about season 3 I didn't like at the time. I've now come full around on so many of them, though. And so if I went back and watched some of those earlier conversations, I'd be cringing, what was I thinking? Now I've processed it, I've come around on it, I've figured out how it works with my view on things. You want to tell the stories that speak to you. I ended Queen of Hearts the way I did because Dustin Carpenter from Wisteria Lodge talks about how he feels, at least at this point, that Lynch ended season 3 pessimistically, and I ended Queen of Hearts optimistically.
Mhm.
And he says that shows the two different creators'
Yeah.
attitudes on the same material. I don't know if I agree the fact that it ended pessimistically. I think that depending on the way you look at it, I mean, the way I see it is like, well, yes, does it end dark? Sure. But it is hopeful. It's not like Cooper disappears and
Yeah.
Laura's left alone in the street, in darkness.
Yeah. And just a little teaser for those listening. We're recording this in a sort of, we had Josh for a limited time, so we're recording a little out of order. We're going to get into some of the weeds and the details
You're right.
how we interpret that ending and all of that, and Cooper's journey in Twin Peaks in the back half. So stay
Right.
tuned.
I just thought if Annie met them and she'd had a prior history with both of them, according to the mythology and also my film, that it would kind of make sense to bring them together at the end and tie it up, not plot wise, but emotional wise, that they had found each other. And I always thought like that was a great kind of emotional way to conclude everything, and then see whatever they did for season 4. Now it looks like they're, well, at this moment, there's not a season 4.
Yeah, and we'll
But
talk about that too for
right,
sure, because I'm
right.
really
I mean, I think there probably would have
so
been a
many
bit.
ups and
I,
downs
I
in
think
that
I
process.
think there really would have been something, but this is not an attempt to be like, well, this is me trying to make season 4. It's not. It's just, if I'm going to continue the story, I have to continue it. So it's, still going to be, focusing on, our main players. For people who watched Queen of Hearts, there was sort of a down to earth, honest, emotional intensity to that film. Well, I'm going to obviously do that with this as well, but it is kind of fun to think about, like, oh wow, I could really do anything here. But I also love this idea of telling the story inside One Eye Jacks and getting into, the politics of that place. And I mean, you could kind of do sort of like a Deadwood style thing
Oh,
of
absolutely, yeah.
inside One Eye Jacks. Like, you think about Swear Engine Saloon and all that. I mean, you could do that in One Eye Jacks and make it compelling and profound.
I mean, Twin Peaks really lends itself to this type of thing where I feel like, and I guess you could say like Star Wars certainly does as well, where it's a world that every character and location seems to have a will of stories behind it. It's not just that situation. I think there's certain properties where if you're going to make a fan film, they're all going to sort of be variations on a single theme. Like the
Right.
story has a very clear, like I suppose if you were going to make a Terminator fan film or something, there's only like so many places you can go with that, really, like based on what they set up in the films. I think with Twin Peaks, you have every door you open, you could just go down and there's endless doors, endless hallways that you can go down and explore. So at this point, I think we're going to shift modes a little bit and talk about some broader Twin Peaks stuff or just random topics. Let the conversation go where it wants, including some stuff with Josh, which we're going to, splice in from the different times we recorded this. But before we get to that, a lot of that's going to be on the Patreon part. So I just want to give people an opportunity first. Where can they find you? Where can they follow you? One more time, where can they support this film?
Well, I have a YouTube channel, Obnoxious and Anonymous. I haven't posted on there in a while just because I've been so busy with this. But in terms of like Facebook, Twitter, X, whatever, you can follow the Queen of Hearts accounts. There, Black Rose has a Facebook page. I also admin on Twin Peaks Worldwide. And we are closing in on 90,000 people right now, which is pretty extraordinary. So yeah, I mean, I'm all over the place.
That's it for the public part of this conversation. But for more from Cameron, Josh, and myself, much more with several hours of additional content on the other side, you can become a $5 a month patron. As I mentioned at the outset, there are also many other rewards for those who decide to join the $5 a month tier on patreon.com/lostinthemovies. So far, for the Films in Focus Patron Choice podcast, patrons have chosen The Red Shoes and May December as my subject. And depending when I'm able to upload what you're listening to right now, they're either currently right in the middle of voting on what I'm going to discuss in May, or they're voting in a runoff between options that tied, or they have just finished voting and chosen what I'm going to cover. In the off months and before this podcast got going, I covered subjects of my own choice. A deep dive into the Barbenheimer phenomenon, which followed up a public piece on Barbie and Oppenheimer, reflections on a couple sci-fi TV episodes, a lengthy essay on Rob Zombie's Halloween films and the larger context of the Halloween series, a viewing diary on True Detective Night Country, the 4th season of the HBO series that I've written about extensively since 2015, and also the previous bonus episode of Twin Peaks Conversations, a short discussion with David Lynch and the American West author Rob King, was also offered as a $5 a month reward. So all of those topics are exclusives that you can find as a $5 a month patron. I've also recently finished conversations with guests on several big films from the past year, which will be appearing throughout the summer. So stay tuned for that as well. And for now, of course, take the leap onto Patreon for the rest of this conversation with Cameron and Josh